You talk to him? Well, if you were to sit down and talk with him and he wanted to talk, uh, would you, and what kind of things would you talk about, perhaps on your podcast?
I don't think I've ever said no to talking to anyone. So, which is,
Would you, would that be a first, or would you make that conversation? Do you believe in the power of
No, I'd
conversation
ask
in
him.
those kinds of contexts?
No, if he was willing to talk to me, I'd talk because I'd like to ask him. I have lots of things I'd like to ask him about. I mean, I've had political types in Canada on my podcast and tried to ask them questions.
To
So I'd like
understand.
to know,
Is there
and
something?
maybe I've got a big part of him wrong.
Yes.
And I probably do. But my observation has been that every chance he had to retreat from his pharaonic position, let's say, he doubled down. And our parliament is not running for the next year. It's still Zoom in. It's still COVID lockdown parliament for the next year. It's already been fatally compromised, perhaps, by the lockdowns for the last couple of years. And this is parliament we're talking about.
Yeah. There's a kind of paralysis, fear-driven paralysis that also, in part, some of the most brilliant people I know are lost in this paralysis. I don't think people assign a word to it, but it's almost like a fear of this unknown thing that lurks in the shadows. And that, unfortunately, that fear is leveraged by people that, who aren't in academic circles, who aren't faculty or students and so on, are more in administration. And they start to use that fear, which makes me quite uncomfortable. It does lend people in the positions of power who are not good at handling that power to become slowly, day by day, a little bit more corrupt.
I was really trying to figure out, the last 2 weeks, thinking this through. It's like, how do you know? Let's say someone asked me a question in the YouTube comment. He said, well, why can I trust your advice on the environmental front? And I thought, that's a really good question. Okay, let's see if we can figure out the principles by which the advice would be trustworthy. Okay, how do you know it's not trustworthy? Well, one potential response to that would be the claims are not in accordance with the facts. But, facts are tricky things, and it depends on where you look for them. So that's a tough one to get right because, for example, Lomborg's fundamental critics argue about his facts, not just his interpretation of them. So that can't be an unerring guide. And so I thought, well, the facts exactly doesn't work because when it's about everything, there's too many facts. So then how do you determine if someone's a trustworthy guide in the face of the apocalyptic unknown? Because that's really the question. And the answer is, they're not terrified tyrants. I think that's the answer. Now, maybe that's wrong. If someone has a better answer...
How do you know if they're a terrified tyrant?
Because they're willing to use compulsion on other people when they could use goodwill. Like, the farmers in Canada objected. They said, look, we have every economic reason to use as little fertilizer as we can because it's expensive. We have satellite maps of where we put the fertilizer. We have cut our fertilizer use so substantially in the last 40 years, you can't believe it, and we grow way more food. We're already breaking ourselves in half. And if you know farmers, especially the ones who still survive, you think those people don't know what they're doing. It's like, yeah, they're pretty damn sophisticated, man. Like, way more sophisticated than our prime minister. And now you tell them, no, it's a 30% reduction, and we don't care how much food you're growing. So it's not a reduction that's dependent on amount of food produced per unit of fertilizer used, which would be, at least, you could imagine it. So, okay, so you're producing this much food, and you use this much fertilizer, so you're hyper efficient. Maybe we take the 10% of farmers who are the least efficient in that metric, and we say to them, you have to get as efficient as the average farmer. And then they say, well, look, our situation's different. We're in a more northern climate. The soil's weaker. You obviously have to bargain with that, but at least you reward them for their productivity. Well, it's like, well, Holland isn't going to have beef. Well, where are they going to get it? Well, you don't need it. It's like, oh, I see. You get to tell me what I can eat now, do you? Really? Okay. And Holland is going to import food from where that's more efficient on the fertilizer front? There's no one more efficient than Holland. And same with Canada. And like, isn't this going to make food prices more expensive? And doesn't that mean that hungry people die? Because that is what it means. So
ultimately, poor people pay the price of these kinds of policies.
not ultimately. Today. That's a crucial distinction because they say, well, ultimately the poor will benefit. Yeah, except the dead ones.
Yes, today.
Today, right.
It seems like the story of war, too, is a time when the poor people suffer from the decision made by the powerful, the rich, the
they
political elite. Yeah. Let me ask you about the war in Ukraine.
Oh, yeah. I got into plenty of trouble about that, too.
You're just a man in a suit talking on microphones and writing brilliant articles. There's also people dying, fighting. It's their land, it's their country, it's their history. This is true for both Russia and Ukraine.
Yep.
It's people trying to ask, they have many dragons and they're asking themselves a question, who are we? What is this? What is the future of this nation? We thought we are a great nation. And I think both countries say this. And they say, well, how do we become the great nation we thought we are?
Yeah.
And so what, first of all, you got in trouble. What's the dynamics of the trouble? And is there something you regret saying?
No. I thought about it a lot. I laid out 4 reasons for the war. And then I was criticized in the Atlantic for the argument was reduced to 1 reason, which was a caricature of the reason. I gave a variety of reasons why the war happened. Mismanagement on the part of the West in relationship to Russia and foreign policy since the wall fell. It's understandable because it's extremely complex. Hyper-reliance on Russia as a cardinal source of energy provision for Europe in the wake of idiot environmental globalist utopianism. The expansionist tendencies of Russia that are analogous in some sense to the Soviet Union empire building. And then the last one, which is the one I got in trouble for, which is Putin's belief or willingness to manipulate his people into believing that Russia is a salvific force in the face of idiot Western wokeism. And that's the one I got in trouble for. It's like, while you're justifying Putin, it's like, it's not only the Russians that think the West has lost its mind. The Eastern Europeans think so too. And do I know that? It's like, well, I went to 15 Eastern European countries this spring, and I talked to 300 political and cultural leaders. And you might say, well, they were all conservatives. It's like, actually, no, they weren't. Most of them were conservatives because it turns out that they're more willing to talk to me. But a good chunk of them were liberals by any stretch of the imagination. And a fair number of them were canceled progressives.
Well, because you're very concerned about the culture wars that perhaps are a signal of a possible bad future for this country and for this part of the world, that reason stands out. And do you, sort of looking back at 4 reasons, think it deserves to have a place in one of the 4?
Oh, absolutely.
Because it is,
well, the 4 was bifurcated, because I said, look, Putin might believe this, and I actually think he does, because I read a bunch of Putin's speeches, and I have been reading them for 15 years. And my sense of people generally, and this was true of Hitler, it's like, well, what did Hitler believe? Well, did you read what he wrote? He just did what he said he was going to do. And you might think, well, some people are so tricky. They have a whole body of elaborated speech that's completely separate from their personality, and their personality is pursuing a different agenda, and this whole body of speech is nothing but affront. Yeah. It's like, good luck finding someone that sophisticated. First of all, if you say things long enough, you're going to believe them.
That's a really interesting and fascinating and important point. Even if you start out as a lie, as a propaganda, I think Hitler is an example of somebody that I think really quickly you start to believe the propaganda.
Well,
it's really interesting.
You've thought a lot about AI systems. It's like, don't you become what you practice? And the answer to that is, well, absolutely. We even know the neurology. It's like when you first formulate a concept, huge swaths of your cortex are lit up, so to speak. But as you practice that, first of all, the right hemisphere stops participating, and then the left participates less and less until you build specialized machinery for exactly that conceptual frame. And then you start to see it, not just think it. And so if you're telling the same lies over and over, who do you think you're fooling? Think, well, I can withstand my own lies. Not if they're effective lies. And if they're effective enough to fool millions of people, and then they reflect them back to you, what makes you think you're going to be able to withstand that? You aren't. And so I do think Putin believes, to the degree that he believes anything, I do believe that he thinks of himself as a bulwark for Christendom against the degeneration of the West. And that's that third way that Dugin and Putin have been talking about, the philosopher Alexander Dugin and Putin, for 15 years. Now, what that is very amorphous. Solzhenitsyn thought the Russians would have to return to the incremental development of Orthodox Christianity to escape from the communist trap. And to some degree, that's happened in Russia because there's been a return to Orthodox Christianity. Now, you could say, yeah, but the Orthodox Church has just been co-opted by the state. And I would say there's some evidence for that. I've heard, for example, that the Metropolitan owns, now I don't know if this is true, owns $5 billion worth of personal property. And I would say there's a bit of a moral hazard in that. And it's possible that the Orthodox Church has been co-opted, but there has been somewhat of an Orthodox revival in Russia, and I don't think that's all bad. Now, even if Putin doesn't believe any of this, if he's just a psychopathic manipulator, and unfortunately, I don't think that's true. I've read his speeches. It doesn't look like it to me, and he is by no means the worst Russian leader of the last 100 years.
Well, there's quite a selection there.
There certainly is, and I say that knowing that. Even if he doesn't believe it, he's convinced his people that it's true. And so we're stuck with the claim in either case. And that's the point I was trying to make in the article.
Sometimes I'm troubled by people that explain things. And a lot of people have reached out to me, experts, telling me how I should feel, what I should think about Ukraine. Oh, you naive Lex, you're so naive, here's how it really is. But then I get to see people that lost their home. I get to see people on the Russian side who believe I genuinely think that there's some degree to which they have love in their heart. They see themselves as heroes saving a land from Nazis.
How else would you motivate young men to go fight?
It's these humans destroying not only their homes, but creating generational hate, destroying the possibility of love towards each other. They're basically creating hate. What I've heard a lot of is on February 24th of this year, hate was born at a scale that region has not seen. Hate towards not Vladimir Putin, hate towards not the soldiers in Russia, but hate towards all Russians. Mm-hmm. Hate that will last generations. And then you can see on just the pain there. And then when all these experts talk about agriculture and energy and geopolitics, and maybe like what you say with the fighting the ideologies of the woke and so on, I just feel like it's missing something deep, that war is not fought about any of those things. War is started and war is averted based on human beings, based on
Well, here's
humanity.
here's another ugly thought, since we haven't had enough so far. We locked everything down for COVID. How much face-to-face communication was there between the West and Vladimir Putin? How about none?
Yeah.
How about that was the wrong amount? Especially given that Europe was completely dependent on Putin for its energy supplies. Well, not completely, but you know what I mean. Materially and significantly. So maybe he had to go talk to him once every 6 months. Maybe he's in a bit of a bubble. Probably.
And not just an information bubble, how all these experts tell me about.
Yeah. No, a human bubble. You bet,
bubble.
man. Look, one of the things I've really learned, there's a real emphasis on hospitality in the Old Testament. I just brought all these scholars together to talk about Exodus. Hey, I have this security team with me, and they're tough military guys, but they're on board for this mission, let's say. And so they went out of their way to be hospitable to my academic guests. They laid out nice platters of meat and cheese and crackers. They spent all day preparing this house I had rented so that we could have a hospitable time with these scholars, most of whom I didn't know well, but who said they would come and spend 8 days talking about this book with me. We rented some jet skis. We had a nice house. We had fun. And we got to know each other. And we got to trust each other because we could see that we could have some fun and that we could let our hair down a bit. We didn't have to be on guard. And that made the talks way deeper. And then we found out we couldn't get through Exodus in 8 days. And so I had proposed very early on that we're going to double the length. And so I pulled 8 people out of their lives for 8 days. That's not an easy thing to do. It's also quite expensive. And the Daily Wire Plus people picked all that up. And they said yes right away. Said, we'd love to do this again. Well, why? Well, partly because intellectually, it was unbelievably engaging. I learned so much. It'll take me like a year to digest it, if I can ever digest it. But they had a really good time. And so when they were offered that combination of intellectual challenge, let's say in hospitality, it was a no-brainer. They just said, every one of them said, if I can do it in any way, I will definitely be there. And I went to Washington a bunch of times, and the culture of hospitality has broken down in Washington. 40% of congressmen sleep in their offices. They don't have apartments. Their family isn't there with them. They don't have social occasions with their fellow Democrats or Republicans, much less across the table. And I tried to have some meetings in Washington that were bilateral a couple of times, get young Republican congressmen and Democrats together to talk. And as soon as they talk, they think, oh, it was so interesting because one of the lunches was about 15 people, half Democrats and half Republicans. And all I'd asked them to do was just spend 3 minutes talking about why you decided to become a congressman, which is not a job I would take, by the way. You spend 25 hours a week fundraising on the telephone. Your family isn't there with you. You have to run for re-election every 2 years. You're beholden to the party apparatus, right? You're vilified constantly. This is not, people think, well, this is a job for the privileged. It's like, yeah, you go and run for Congress and find out how much fun it is and put your family on the line and then have to beg for your job every 2 years while your enemies, the worst of your enemies and the worst of your friends are viciously henpecking you. And so anyways, we had them all sit around a table and said, okay, just say why you ran for Congress. It was so cool, especially for a Canadian, because you Americans, you're so bloody theatrical. It's such something to watch. It was like Mr. Smith goes to Washington for every one of them. It's like, well, this country has given us so much. Our families have been we've benefited so much from our time here. We think this is a wonderful country. We really felt that we should give back. Then the next one would talk, and it was like exactly the same story. And then it didn't matter if they were Republican or Democrat. You couldn't tell the difference. No one could. And was it genuine? It's like, well, are you genuine? You think these people are worse than you? First of all, they're not. Second of all, they're probably better, all things considered. It's not that easy to become a congressman. And I'm sure there's some bad apples in the bunch, but by and large, you walk away from your meetings with these people and you think, pretty impressive.
They really are giving a part of themselves in the name of service. Maybe over time, they become cynical and become jaded and worn down by the whole system. But I think a lot of it...
Could you imagine that?
is healed, I think, and I don't think I'm in part naive, but not fully, that a lot of it is healed through the power of conversation, just basic social interaction. I do think that
You bet, man.
the effects of this pandemic,
especially by listening.
Listen, just sitting there, and it doesn't have to be talking about the actual issue. It's actually humor and all those kinds of things, about personal struggles, all those kinds of things that remind you that you're all just humans.
Yeah. Well, the great leaders that I've met, and I've met some now, they go listen to their constituents. It's not a policy discussion. It's not an ideology discussion. They go say, okay, what's your life like, and what are your problems, and tell me about them. And then they listen, and then they're struck by them, and then they gather up all that misery and they bring it to the congressional office or to the parliament, and they think, here's what the people are crying out for. And the good leaders, that's a leader. Leader listens. So I talked to Jimmy Carr about comedy, and he's sold out stages worldwide on a tour, being funny. That's hard. He said, comedy is the most stand-up comedy, which is what I do in some real sense. It's a thing I do that it's most akin to what I'm doing on my book tours, I would say. It's the closest analog. He said it's the most dialogical enterprise. And I thought, well, why? What do you mean? Because see, it's just a monologue. And it's a prepared monologue. I mean, you have to interact dynamically with the audience while you're telling your jokes, and you got to get the timing right, but you have a body of jokes. He said, well, here's how you prepare the jokes. And I've been told this by other comedians. You go to 50 clubs before you go on your tour, and you got some new material and you think it's funny, and you go into a club and you lay out your new material and people laugh at some of it. And you pay attention to what they laugh at and what they don't laugh at. So you subject yourself to the judgment of the crowd, and you get rid of everything that isn't funny. And if you do that enough, even if you're not that funny, the crowd will tell you what's funny. So you can imagine you do 50 shows, and each is an hour long, and you collect 2 minutes of humor from each show. So you throw away 2 hours, more than 98% of it. You collect 2 minutes per show. So you're not very funny at all. You're like funny 2% of the time. You aggregate that, man, you're a scream. And so that's what a leader does. That is what a leader does, is goes out and he aggregates the misery, and the hopes. And then I do think that's revivifying to someone who would otherwise be cynical and jaded, because then the person can say to themselves, despite the inadequacies of the system and my inadequacies, I'm gathering up the misery and the hope, and I'm bringing it forward where it can be redressed.
Giving it a voice.
Yep, that's right, giving it a voice.
Can you